So today I have a different type of video for you guys. I am going to do a video about this guy. His name is Darryl Cooper. He was on a interview with Tucker Carlson on a podcast, and he said some things about Winston Churchill that are just completely not true, and he has a very weird and misunderstood vision on Winston Churchill during World War II. Well, it's funny to hear Mr. Cooper say it himself the best.
Whenever you have those things, you're going to have taboos. You're going to have certain ways that certain topics have to be talked about that are going to guarantee that topic is just profoundly misunderstood.
This is going to be so fun to do.
I don't have a headache. I'm just preparing.
And I'm American. I'm not English, so I don't have any weird motive in asking this. But how would you assess Winston Churchill?
I got in trouble with my podcast partner, Jocko Willink, one time because he's a New England Dutchman whose his family, it's near and dear to, they're Dutch, but very near and dear to their heart that Winston Churchill is a hero, right?
Well, everyone
thinks that. He really thinks that.
Churchill is respected globally because of his role in defeating fascism during World War II. It's not weird to admire a leader who stood firm against Hitler when the world was on the brink of its collapse. Reducing his legacy to everyone think that he's a hero dismisses the incredible impact that Winston Churchill had that shaped the course of our history. It's not just about blind hero worship, it's about recognizing real historical achievements.
And I told him that I think, and maybe I'm being a little hyperbolic, maybe, but I told him, maybe trying to provoke him a little bit, that I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War.
Do you hear what he is saying? Churchill, the chief villain of World War II? Oh man, this is going to be a long video.
Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities. But I believe, and I think when you really get into it and tell the story right and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than an invasion of Poland.
Wait, tell the story right, you said, and don't leave anything out? I think you just left out a tiny fraction, Mr. Cooper. Like the rearmament of Germany, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the Anschluss of Austria, the violation of the Munich agreements in which the Germans captured or occupied the Sudetenland, the whole occupation of Czechoslovakia, and knowing that France and Britain had guaranteed Poland.
Ooh, that's kind of small.
Or just, at every step of the way, like people are very often, I find, surprised to learn. There's a two-step process.
Well,
right?
why don't you just make the case for that? Okay, so you've made your statement. A lot of people are thinking, well, wait a second. You said Churchill, my childhood hero, the guy with the cigar.
Yeah. Well, and the next thought that comes into their head is that, oh, you're saying Churchill was the chief villain, therefore his enemies, Adolf Hitler and so forth, were
Stalin,
the protagonists, right?
Yeah.
That they're the good guys if you think he's a villain. That's not the case. That's not what I'm saying. Germany, look, they put themselves into a position, and Adolf Hitler is chiefly responsible for this, but his whole regime is responsible for it, that when they went into the East in 1941, they launched a war where they were completely unprepared to deal with the millions and millions of prisoners of war, of local political prisoners and so forth that they were going to have to handle. They went in with no plan for that.
For us, it is so easy to say in hindsight that the Germans had no idea what they were really getting themselves into by invading the Soviet Union. It's really easy for us. The invasion of the Soviet Union by the Nazis was a calculated act rooted in Adolf Hitler's ideology, particularly articulated in the book of Hitler, which is called Mein Kampf, that everybody knows. Central to this ideology was the concept of Lebensraum, which aimed to secure more living space for the Aryan race on the eastern side of Europe. Hitler's profound hatred of communism and Marxism led him to view Bolsheviks as subhumans, categorizing them alongside with the Jews, who he also saw as Untermenschen, which means subhumans. The invasion was driven not only by a desire for racial purity, but also by economic motivations, as Germany sought to acquire the vast resources of the East. Thus, the invasion was a deliberate strategy rather than a reckless miscalculation, reflecting a clear ambition for domination and control. To say that they were
completely unprepared
is not really accurate. The Nazi ideology prioritizes ruthless efficiency over human treatment, with strategies in place for managing captured soldiers as forced labor or for extermination.
And they just threw these people into camps, and millions of people ended up dead there. You know, you have like letters as early as July, August 1941 from commandants of these makeshift camps that they're setting up for these millions of people who are surrendering or people they're rounding up. And so it's 2 months after, a month or two after Barbarossa was launched. And they're writing back to the high command in Berlin saying, we can't feed these people. We don't have the food to feed these people. And one of them actually says, rather than wait for them all to slowly starve this winter, wouldn't it be more humane to just finish them off quickly now?
What the fuck is this? I don't know.
And so this is like 2 months into the invasion, right? And like my view on this, I argue with my Zionist interlocutors about this all the time with regard to the current war in Gaza. Look, man, like maybe you as the Germans, you felt like you had to invade to the east. Maybe you thought that Stalin was such a threat, or that if he launched a surprise attack and seized the oil fields in Romania, that you would now not have the fuel to actually respond and you'd be crippled and all of Europe would be under threat, and whatever it was that like maybe you thought you had to do that. But at the end of the day, you launched that war with no plan to care for the millions and millions of civilians and prisoners of war that were going to come under your control. And millions of people died because of that, right?
3.3 million Soviet prisoners died in captivity by the Germans. You know how? I will let my friend Chris explain it quickly.
They weren't put in gas chambers. They weren't shot by the millions, though many of them were shot. Most of them died from exposure and starvation.
Thank you, Chris. This just saved me some more headache. To continue my story, Hitler ordered that the Soviet POWs should not be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention because the Soviets did not sign the Geneva Conventions themselves. And, Mr. Cooper, have you ever heard about Generalplan Ost? That was established before 1941, before even the invasion happened of the Soviet Union? No? Well, let me explain it for you. Generalplan Ost was a secret plan by the Nazis during the Second World War to Germanize parts of Central and Eastern Europe in order to increase the Lebensraum, like I said before, living space for the German people. Part of that plan was ethnic cleansing through subjugation, expulsion, and destruction of the indigenous Slavic population. So, what does this tell us? This tells us that the Germans knew what they were going to do with all the POWs, with all the prisoners, with all the civilian population of the Soviet Union in the East. They knew what they were going to do with them. Oh yeah, and the suggestion from camp commandants to finish them off quickly reflects more of a horrific mindset and not really a lack of planning.
And you can look at it and say like, So get back to your main question about Churchill. You know, if you go to 1939, when the Germans and the Soviet Union invade Poland, as soon as that war's wrapped up on the German side, Hitler starts firing off peace proposals to Britain and France because they had already declared war. He didn't expect them to declare war, actually.
God damn it! You can't make this shit up!
Hitler perceived Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister at the time, as weak in his responses to Germany's provocations, prompting him to continually test the limits.
Never to go to war with one another again.
The declaration of war by Britain and France was a direct response to Hitler's blatant violations of sovereignty through the invasion of Poland and the aggressive expansion of the Third Reich. Hitler was a person that liked to gamble with his decisions, and again Hitler thought and gambled he could navigate these risks without any consequence, even when he knew that there was a risk of war, and even that he knew that France and Britain guaranteed Poland's independence. Also, to think that Hitler would stop after the invasion of Poland is just nonsense. Hitler's economy was doing very bad. Hitler knew that the economic system in Germany would eventually fail, and that's why Hitler needed to expand Germany into Europe. A really great historic YouTube channel named Tick History made an excellent video about why Hitler did assume that Britain wouldn't fight them. In there, he also explains a little bit about the economy that Germany was in the 1939s and 1940s.
However, we need to be aware that the economy of the Third Reich was dying from about 1937 onwards, as Gottsally shows in Hitler's Beneficiaries. In the first 2 years of the Nazi regime alone, the Reich spent 300 times more than it was earning, and its debt grew by 10.3 billion Reichsmarks. In 1939, their revenue was about 18 billion Reichsmarks, yet their expenditure was 36.8 billion. 3.3 billion of that was payments on the interest of the debt, and the only solution to this problem was to go to war and extract resources from the rest of Europe to cover the problem, which is what drove them to war.
Like there's a famous scene where he kind of throws a fit when he finds out that they did do that. And so he doesn't want to fight France. He doesn't want to fight Britain. He feels that's going to weaken Europe when we've got this huge threat to the east, the communist threat over there. And he starts firing off peace proposals. He says, let's not do this. Like, we can't do this. And of course, a year goes by, 1940 comes around, and they're still at war. And so he launches his invasion to the west, takes over France, takes over Western and Northern Europe.
Oh, weird that Hitler then invades the Low Countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and then invades France, Denmark and Norway on the 10th of May when Churchill became Prime Minister, literally on the day when the Germans started to invade the Low Countries. So yeah, it's Churchill's fault, of course, that World War II got escalated to this point, because Hitler also wanted peace with Britain. But Sander, Hitler wanted peace after he occupied France and the Low Countries. He still wanted to sue peace for Britain. That's why this quote from the movie Darkest Hour is so powerful.
He will be reasonable.
When will the lesson be learned? When will the lesson be learned? How many more dictators must be wooed, appeased, good God, given him mixed privileges, before we learn? You cannot reason with a tiger when your head is in its mouth!
Once that's done, the British have, escaped at Dunkirk. There's no British force left on the continent. There's no opposing force left on the continent. In other words, the war is over, and the Germans won. Okay.
My brain hurts.
Slap, 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 clap, 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 slap, slap, slap.
Won the war. The war just got started.
But by what point?
Fall of 1940, right? So there's literally no opposing force on the continent. And throughout that summer, Adolf Hitler is firing off radio broadcasts, giving speeches, literally sending planes over to drop leaflets over London and other British cities, trying to get the message to these people that Germany does not want to fight you.
What? What the fuck?
Of course, Hitler did not want to fight the British after they took control of Western Europe. His primary goal was to expand eastwards, and he didn't want Britain, isolated on an island that was difficult to reach, attacking him from behind, while he needed all his troops and resources focused on the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler was well aware of what had happened in World War I with the dangers of fighting on two fronts, and he did not want to repeat that mistake. It was in his best interest to avoid a two-front war. The Battle of Britain began on the July 10th, 1940, and just 9 days later, on July 19th, Hitler issued a peace proposal. He made an appeal to reason to Great Britain, urging them to avoid destruction of a great world empire. However, he also made it clear that rejecting this offer would result in a full-scale attack using all the forces at the Axis powers' command. At the same time, Hitler was already planning Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. What would you have done if all of Europe had fallen under the control of a fascist regime, with your ally France defeated and your army nearly annihilated in France? An army that was saved thanks to Winston Churchill's heroic decision, the same man you call a villain, Mr. Cooper, and of course the balls of steel of the British people who sailed across the channel. What would you have done when your country was under attack from the German Luftwaffe and that Hitler had repeatedly lied to you, Britain, breaking agreements to further expand the Third Reich? There was much debate in the British Parliament about whether to sue for peace, and Lord Halifax even was pushing Churchill to do so. But Churchill remained resolute in continuing the fight, and in hindsight, we should all be grateful for his determination. Had he not had the courage to stand firm, who knows how many more Slavs and Jews would have perished in the genocide of World War II? How far would Hitler have expanded? Would I be here in the Netherlands speaking German today? To claim that Hitler wanted peace and Churchill didn't is just telling a story with a bias, ignoring the far-reaching consequences that peace with Hitler would have brought with it.
Like, we don't want to fight you. Offering peace proposals that, it said, you keep all your overseas colonies. We don't want any of that. We want Britain to be strong. The world needs Britain to be strong, especially as we face this communist threat and so forth. Like, this is what's going on. And I think that if there were people in Britain who, if they hadn't put it this way, if they hadn't been so successful at delegitimizing the peace approach by demonizing Neville Chamberlain and so forth, and holding him responsible for the invasion of Poland.
Demonizing Neville Chamberlain? You mean the man who was waving a paper after the Munich agreements, shouting,
Never to go to war with one another again.
Who then, 5 months later, got played by Hitler by annexing the whole of Czechoslovakia, and 6 months after that invaded Poland? Mr. Cooper, you are referring to one of the most controversial moments in the 20th century of diplomacy. It's no wonder Neville Chamberlain got criticized for his policy of the appeasement towards Adolf Hitler. I need a break.
I have had an extremely stressful day. Someone give me a cigarette. Now! Thank you. Light!
That people would have been, they would have understood, like, we don't need a repeat of the First World War. We don't, which is not what ended up happening, but that's what everybody thought was going to happen. And so Churchill, you have a guy, Churchill wanted a war. He wanted to fight Germany. And the reason that I don't begrudge him that, people can, national leaders, you can fight whoever you want. If you feel like your the long-term interests of the British Empire are threatened by the rise of a powerful continental power like Germany, and you need to check that those are great power games, and you play them the way you feel like you need to play them. That's fine.
You serious?
Churchill wanted a war? I think that Hitler wanted to expand his Third Reich. Not Winston Churchill wanted to expand Britain. Churchill wanted to defend the Allies who just got overrun by Germany. They had a defensive agreement with Poland that got invaded by Hitler. What do you not understand about that? I can go over again what Hitler did wrong like I did in the beginning of the video. Like the rearmament of Germany, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the Anschluss of Austria, the violation of the Munich agreements in which the Germans captured or occupied the Sudetenland, the whole occupation of Czechoslovakia, and knowing that France and Britain had guaranteed Poland.
The reason I resent Churchill so much for it is that he kept this war going when he had no way to go back and fight this war. All he had were bombers. He was literally, by 1940, sending bomber fleets to go firebomb the Black Forest, just to burn down sections of the Black Forest. Just rank terrorism, going through and starting to, what eventually became just the carpet bombing, the saturation bombing of civilian neighborhoods, to kill, is the purpose of which was to kill as many civilians as possible. And all the men were out in the field. All the fighting age men were out in the field. And so this is old people, it's women and children, and they knew that. And they were wiping these places out. It was as gigantic scaled terrorist attacks, the greatest, scale of terrorist attacks you've ever seen in world history.
Okay, this is just going too far. The bombing of the Black Forest never even happened. And it was not a plan to bomb innocent civilians. In mid-August 1939, Winston Churchill and General Louis Spears visited France and observed the Black Forest across the Rhine. The French informed them that the fort was filled with ammunition dumps, with convoys constantly transporting supplies. The Black Forest, spanning 2,300 square miles in the southwest of Germany, had long been fortified and by 1939-1940 was housed with the Wehrmacht High Command and Hitler's headquarters. When World War II began, General Spears and Leopold Armory urged Sir Kingsley Wood, the Air Minister, to bomb the ammunition dumps in the forest, emphasizing its vulnerability due to a dry summer. However, Wood dismissed the idea, arguing it was private property, sarcastically comparing it to bombing Essen. The bombing itself never even happened.
Why would he do that?
because it was the only means that they had to continue fighting at the time. You know, they didn't have the ability to reinvade Europe. And so he needed to keep this war going until he accomplished what he hoped to accomplish. We know now there's actually a really great series of books. It's one of the best. I recommend it to everybody, but it's really expensive now. And it's 6 long volumes called History of British Special Operations in the Second World War.
Wait for it.
And one of the books gets into
Here it comes.
the level of just the extent
Almost there.
of media operations, propaganda operations, everything that they were running in the United States to eventually drag us into that war.
God, please, no! 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 No!
Churchill sought US help because Britain was struggling to fight Germany alone after the fall of France. He needed American military and economic support, including weapons, supplies, and naval assistance to survive the war. Churchill knew that US involvement was crucial to defeating the Axis powers. President Roosevelt wanted to keep the US out of World War II due to strong isolationist sentiment among the American public, the Neutrality Acts that restricted military support to warring nations, and the ongoing economic recovery from the Great Depression, and political pressure from isolationists in Congress. Although he supported the Allies indirectly, he couldn't commit to military involvement until the attack on Pearl Harbor, which shifted the public opinion and provided a direct cause of war. But it was not because of Churchill that the Americans eventually joined the war. It was the attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor that got the Americans involved.
And that was his whole plan. His whole plan was we don't have a way to fight this war ourselves. This war is over. We need either the Soviet Union or the United States to do it for us. And that was the plan. And kept the war going long enough for that plan to come to fruition. And to me, it's a craven, ugly way to fight a war. And
what was the motive?
Well, Churchill's got a long and complicated history. I mean, he's somebody who
that was the wryest smile I think I've ever seen.
Yeah. Well, look, I think on one level, there was a sense that Churchill was sort of humiliated by his performance in the First World War as the head of the Admiralty, and he was out in the cold for a long time.
I mean, Gallipoli.
Yeah. And which, that was his operation.
Yeah.
I mean, and so he was rightly held responsible for that and seen as responsible for one of the great disasters that the British suffered during that war.
It's important to recognize that no leader, not one, is perfect, including Winston Churchill. He of course had his flaws and controversial decisions, especially regarding colonial policies and his views on certain social issues. However, labeling Churchill as the main villain of the war is absurd. Adolf Hitler posed an existential threat not just to Britain, but to the entire world. His aggressive expansionism and genocidal policies resulted in unimaginable suffering and destruction across Europe and beyond. The horrors of the Holocaust and the brutal occupation of various nations highlighted the catastrophic consequences of the Hitler regime. And the failure of the Gallipoli campaign cannot be attributed solely to Winston Churchill. While he advocated for the operation, it involved collective decision-making among multiple Allied nations and military leaders. Logistical challenges, intelligence failure, and the broader context of World War I also contributed to the campaign's unsuccessful outcome. Thus, it was a result of various factors, and not just only Churchill's influence.
And so I think part of it was probably kind of personal. He wanted redemption. He wanted to go out there and prove that he's the warlord that can go out there and fight this big war. Probably. I think part of it, I read about Churchill and he strikes me as a psychopath.
I just can't do it. I can't take this shit no more, man.
But he's also he was a drunk. He was very childish in strange ways. People would talk about how, as an adult, as prime minister, they'd find him in his room and he's playing with action figures like war toys and army men and stuff, and would get mad when people would interrupt him, when he was doing this. This is a strange fellow, There's all those things. But then you get into, why was Winston Churchill such a dedicated booster of Zionism from early on in his life, right?
I can't. Chris, please take it over from me.
From early on.
There you go. Remember I said a minute ago when he smiled and I said what was bouncing around in his mind was it was the Jews. And now he finally admits it. That's what this is all about, is that at the end of the day, it's about the Jews. And that's all the answer you need as to where this guy's mind is.
I will spare you the rest of the interview, but he discusses how Churchill, who was, before he was in office, financially struggling, and was helped by people, referring to the Zionists, and then placed in a leadership position by these same people. Cooper is spreading disinformation and presenting facts completely out of context to fit his own narrative. I just can't wrap my head around his portrayal of Churchill as a villain. I'm also a bit disappointed that Tucker Carlson didn't challenge him more on his views, so I felt the need to make this video. Also, check out these two videos of my friends JD and Chris, who were countering Cooper's views as well with facts. I'll put the link in the description. And Mr. Cooper, I think your whole view that you have on Winston Churchill is
profoundly misunderstood.